My name is Ciaran. I work with the National Parks and Wildlife Service. I'm starting off, I hope you can see the picture with the shot from my former neighbourhood. I lived in Glenveigh National Park for 15, 17 years. And I just think it's interesting, having started in Europe, Michael talked about landscape, let's go down to a person. I just think it's kind of interesting to talk about one person who's a cultural asset. He has the National Park on the left-hand side. He's surrounded by SACs and SPAs. He lives, the nearest town is Falcarra in County Donegal. It's an area where there still is net emigration and where there really is a social problem of just the drainage of young people out of the landscape and away from the culture. He's a farmer who supports himself by off-farm activities. He is surrounded by bog, which he cuts every year. Interesting one, that. He's also living in the Gaeltacht, the Irish-speaking part of Ireland. This particular individual, who I know well in the house, isn't an Irish speaker, and of course that's a problem then, because people are very concerned about the loss of Irish in some of the core areas. And of course he is hugely knowledgeable about where he lives and how he farms and how his father and his grandfather farmed in the same place. And I'll come back to individuals in a minute. Just, you probably know all this, but NPWS, our functions, we manage state-owned lands which are Natura designated, especially the national parks, the nature reserves, and of course through strategies, projects and schemes we're involved in a lot of other things. The designation process I do have to mention, because it's an important part of the Natura process. So that's selection of sites, survey, mapping, notification, appeals and so on. Engagement with landowners and land users and with other regulatory bodies and promoters of schemes, awareness, education, and of course enforcement, because at the end of the day you do have to have the powers and use them from time to time to protect. Not the preferred option, but an inevitable option in some instances. I have a lot of stuff here about designation. I'm not sure whether it's all that useful, but just to say, in the Natura 2000 network in Ireland is SACs and SPAs. There are 439, I think it is, SACs and 154 SPAs. The designation process is almost all complete, but we're going through the final formal designation through statutory instrument at the moment, and 173 of the SACs are done and 139 of the SPAs. We still have to consider whether we need more marine SPAs for birds offshore, and we've just finished with the Department of DCCAEK, who are responsible, amongst other things, for petroleum and oil and so on. And they've used a lot of funding to do very good offshore surveys with us, looking at cetaceans, seabirds and other things that Eamon Kelly in the corner there was largely instrumental in kicking off. And we also have a scientific reserve and a couple of marine SACs. But the designation of Natura is largely done. I should say at this stage, echoing Michael, the Birds and Habitats directives have been crucial to nature conservation, especially during the last boom, where we certainly, it helped enormously to protect many important areas. And we knew very little about a lot of stuff before the Natura directives the nature directives came into place. And one of the things we had to do was to find out an awful lot more about what we have and hold. And then it's like I kind of ran out of steam. I just forgot this slide to finish it off. The Article 17 reporting process, on which we report on the status of all of the habitats and species protected under European legislation, shows us that many of the habitats are in bad condition or in poor condition. Surprisingly, in that context, at least half of the species are considered to be in good condition, and that's an anomaly that I've never really managed to rationalise as to how does that happen. It does suggest maybe we're being a bit harsh in regard to habitats in the whole system, which is applied across Europe for monitoring. So our target is, from our perspective, is principally to achieve favourable conservation status for all these habitats and species we're protecting across Ireland. In the context of culture and people, I think there are three problems with the directives that we might think about. The first is Article 2 of the directive, which is about social and economic. I'll come back to that in a second. As a general thing, designation for species can be difficult, and Michael mentioned the bogs. People will have heard about rows about hen harriers, and I just refer back to, do you remember the sort of throwaway remark about the swans and the snails? This was to do with the development of the motorway to Cork from Dublin and going through Pollardstown Fen. So you had a fantastic natural area, but the argument boiled down to an invisible snail as far as most people were concerned. And sometimes the species thing becomes trivialized and not helpful. And then the other thing is the money. Where is the money in all of this? We often talk about willingness to pay in terms of the value of nature. A more useful metric, into my mind, would be the willingness to forego, because ultimately designation has a burden and somebody is going to lose somewhere, and how do you deal with that? Article 2 of the Habitats Directive says measures pursuant to this directive shall take account of economic and social and cultural requirements, and that's very good. But interestingly, the European courts, in a raft of decisions, have concentrated on other teeth in the directive, and you just don't see this coming in, and that, I think that's a problem that's never really been properly addressed. So there's a contradiction there between Article 2 and the rest of the directives, and it's very difficult for the ordinary citizens to see this, because this is early on in the directive. They're going to read that one and say, well, hang on a second, surely my economic, social and cultural requirements outweigh some of the scientific stuff that you're spouting. And so a few, just again, not looking at cultural assets, but the sort of the general culture of society and the people who are affected. Most of the designations that we have are in the west of Ireland. There's a heavy burden on Mayo, Connemara, Donegal and Kerry. Many islands are totally or almost covered, or almost totally covered by designation. And I'm looking forward to hearing Patrick talking later about that issue on the Aran Islands, which are pretty well pure limestone pavements, so it's all a habitat listed in the Habitats Directive. The Gaeltacht areas, the Irish-speaking areas, are heavily designated. And most of these areas, they're designated because they have the natural habitats there, and that's perhaps because of agricultural and economic development that was constrained over centuries, possibly due to soils, climate, small holdings, location, and so on. And the land ownership there is generally of small areas, so people own small farms which are very difficult to make a living of, and they may have large areas then of turf cutting rights or grazing rights. That's generally badly documented and really hard to manage. I loved a colleague of mine a few years ago talking about raised bogs, where he said there was 9 levels of ownership of a raised bog, of which the genuine squatter was the 4th most legal. Work that one out. That's just a map of the thing, of the designated areas, and you'll see on the right, which is the SPAs, the huge blobs in the middle of Ireland, which are the hen harrier SPAs. Interesting because they require a big area to forage, to breed, but that's about the size of County Louth. They're a bit more, just for one bird, of which there are about maybe 150 breeding pairs. So it shows some of the practical difficulties in going from the theoretical designation into the engagement with landowners. And a few more things about people. People are resilient. They have a deep attachment to land. They have a deep attachment to land ownership. And their primary interest, like all of us, is making a living and providing for their children. And they're thinking of where will their children live. Going back to the first picture, will my son, my daughter be able to have a house near where I live? And we have a tradition in this country of trying to provide in the countryside for our families close by where we live. They don't like being told what to do by Dublin or Brussels, but they do depend on farm payments to a great extent. Interesting thing, the designations process now is kind of 20, 25 years old, so a new generation is more and more inheriting all of this land. And they have ambitions, and they have new ambitions. Generally speaking, they have more education, they see much more potential, and of course with new technology there is more potential for new things. Another thing is social media has changed the whole environment, it seems to me, of opinion versus expertise. And I just mentioned here the vaccine debate. You know, there's overwhelming scientific evidence that vaccines are good. There's a hell of a lot of opinion that they're bad, utterly unsupported. But that reflects, I think, in a whole lot of the debate between the science on the one side and then people's opinions and how that is rated overall, and the instant access to opinion over the years it takes to come up with a formulated scientific position. And another thing I think it's worth throwing into the discussion here is that often the most vocal champions of environmental protection are actually not from the area that they want to protect. Like myself as a Dub, I love that area in the west of Ireland, but I am from there, you know, and that's an issue. It's an issue that we see, and it's probably worth just reflecting on as we talk about it. In terms of our approachment to engagement, person-to-person engagement obviously is it's the best tool, and I think it's fair to say that over the many years, in NPWS because of resource issues. We have underachieved in putting that into practice. From the initial conversations with landowners all the way through to ongoing stuff, which we do as much as we can of, but which could be much more. We recently launched the third National Biodiversity Action Plan, and we reviewed in that process the second and the implementation of it. And the area that we felt actually that came out worst in terms of implementation was awareness and engagement. So we now have a greater emphasis politically and starting to see a bit more funding available for personnel to engage with owners and users. And that's one huge area. And then we also need to engage more with the regulatory bodies so that we're sure that they're doing what they need to do. On the subject of finance, there was a very interesting paper published recently by Rachel Morrison and Craig Bullock on financial flows for biodiversity in Ireland. And if you haven't seen it, it's really worth a look. And they looked at 2010 to 2015, and there was $1.5 billion that they identified that you could label as having a biodiversity benefit in Ireland. That's a huge amount of money, and you'd wonder how come things aren't perfect if you spend that amount of money. So it's very interesting to go into. About 80% of that funding comes from EU funding instruments, and particularly the CAP, and that's going to continue to be the case. So we need to work very hard in terms of getting the best, and I'll come back to that in a little bit in 1 second. And then, but just to say, another thing, a lesson learned just recently, the recent National Development Plan, you might have seen that there's a lot of money gone into culture, heritage, and the Gaeltacht. And it struck me at the launch of it that really, from the conservation sector, we should be really, really envious of the cultural side and how they have turned the message around from sort of begging bowl to we are your asset, we are your asset. So if we could get the same argument going with natural capital, this is our asset. And we need to look hard at how they managed to achieve that. And they did it, I think, by a lot of thought, a lot of effort, and a lot of good marketing of the positive messages and an avoidance, perhaps, to some extent, of the negative. Just coming towards the end, if you leave planning and development issues aside, the key to conservation of the terrestrial and freshwater habitats, obviously, is agriculture, fisheries, and agriculture and forestry, and then to a large extent, I guess, in the marine fisheries as well, if you were going into that space. So here's a burren cow with the question, how do you make it worthwhile for farmers to farm in an unintensive manner, but to take necessary steps to restore habitats or species? We want people in the countryside. Everybody wants it. It's government policy anyway. But from a nature conservation, as Yvonne said at the start, we need people in the landscape. And that's really one of the very big questions. How can I, as a small farmer with normal aspirations, continue to live and have my cultural and also conservation influence in the world? There's an awful lot of effort going into this. We would engage hugely with the Department of Agriculture on both agriculture and forestry issues. There's been an amount of success, and I just mentioned a few here. The LIFE projects have been really useful because they put people with time to talk to people into the landscape. The Burren Life also set, I think, a new mark in terms of the use of local knowledge and skill and the putting of local people at the top of the pyramid in the conservation discussion. And we follow that with Kerry Life, which is for protecting pearl mussels in 2 catchments, and Ciaran Life that we'll be hearing about later. And my colleague Frank Donoghue, who's in the room today, was just over dropping off an application for an integrated project, which is a much bigger one, focusing on blanket bog landscapes, which we hope will be successful in the coming months. And then there's others, the Curlew Conservation Pilot we're putting a lot of work into. The Department of Agriculture has these European innovation projects, or the locally led schemes, and the hen harrier and pearl mussel, with a lot of effort going in there. They're investing hugely in people time. And then I've just a few examples: the Community Wetlands Forum, Abbey Leaks Bog, the Red Grouse projects going on, I think, in 27 places in the country, the Rockabill Rosie Tern project, which are all genuine bottom-up projects. So there's all these little projects in scale which add up to a substantial benefit. And by the way, sorry Photius, but we want the Rockabill project to win the Natura prize, not the not your one. And an amount of success at government level. I mean, many aspects of GLAS in this current round of the EU funding period have vastly improved. It's not perfect by any means yet, and we'll work on that.
considerable improvements in the native woodland forestry incentives, huge change and turnaround in that, and we're starting to see good take-up. A lot of water community officers in the LAWCO organisation, and there's 30 new advisors being announced for the ag sector who are going to be working with farmers on agriculture and environment. In our own small way, things are improving. We're finally getting staff in. We've got a dozen new rangers in the last year, and we're getting new scientific staff in the coming months. And I mentioned the NDP funding, and interestingly, the Taoiseach launching the NDP, which is capital money, said, of course, you can't successfully deliver capital without getting current funding to have staff and time. So that's a discussion that my top managers are pursuing actively at the moment. So that's sort of where we are, in as fast a nutshell as I could do. I just wanted to take one moment to plug, if you want to reserve 21st of February next year, because one of the outcomes of the biodiversity plan we felt was we needed to have a much bigger discussion with engaging in these areas, including culture, including the arts, as well as the usual sort of nature conservation issues. And we're calling it New Horizons for Nature, which there will be more about, and I think there's been consultation with some of the people in the room about what we might have. Thank you very much.